And turn over with me to Genesis chapter 12. Be studying for some time now. I don't know how long, but it's going to be a pretty in-depth study of the character of Abraham himself. And so I was kind of looking through these chapters in Genesis. Of course, if you've ever read and studied the life of Abraham, you know that there's a lot about Abraham being a man of faith. And I don't know if I have that many faith lessons or not, but you're probably going to get tired of hearing about the faith of Abraham. But we're certainly going to be looking at that and as we go through these studies. And since we're starting off here in chapter 12 with him, that's exactly how we're going to start, with the idea or a sermon entitled Abraham, a Man of Faith. I will mention real briefly here too, before we get too far into our lesson, Hank and I have some lectureships and meetings coming up in the next couple of months, and so you're probably going to be getting a heavy dose of either one of us or the other. We'll try to balance that out as best as we can, but if you wonder what's going on, that's what's going on. We have some speaking schedules that we have to coordinate with each other, and of course with our work here. So November, hopefully, we'll go back to normal. Abraham, though, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham's, you think about the Old Testament. If I were to ask you, what are some of the great characters in the Old Testament, I think the name Abraham is one that would immediately come to mind. But Abraham is also not just a great character of the Old Testament, he's also a great character of the New Testament. His shadow is cast all across the New Testament as you read. And of course, the thing that the Scripture emphasizes about him the most is the fact that he was a man of faith. And so we're going to get right into Genesis 12 here this morning, because we've got a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it. And basically just two main ideas that I want to talk about concerning Abraham and his faith this morning. The first thing that I want us to notice in this series is what we're going to call the fundamentals of Abraham's faith. And whenever we talk about this being the fundamentals of Abraham's faith, I think it's important to point out it's not just the fundamentals of Abraham's faith, but it's really the same fundamentals of our faith today when we talk about our faith in God or our faith in Christ. And there's two things that I want to emphasize concerning the fundamentals. The first thing that I want to point out is, if we're going to have biblical faith, and again, I'm not interested in the world's definition or religious definition of what faith is. Bible faith, what is? One of the first things that you're going to have Bible faith is you have to have some type of revelation from God. In other words, if you don't have either God speaking or God revealing something, it's impossible for a person to do that by faith. And that's exactly what you have here with Abraham. Notice verse 1 of Genesis chapter 12 with me. In verse 1 it says, "Now the Lord had said," there's revelation. "The Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." The basis of Abraham's faith is revelation. While Abraham was still living in Ur of the Chaldees, the Lord spoke to him. The Lord told him something. And the Lord told him to leave this land and to go in another land that he was going to show him. Well, in order for Abraham to do that by faith, God had to tell him to do it, right? God had to reveal that to him. And so it's important for us to understand when we read about something in the Bible or someone in the Bible doing something by faith, the first fundamental that you're going to have is you're going to have revelation from God. And the same thing is true for us as Christians today. If we're going to worship God by faith, we have to have God telling us to do something or doing something in a certain way. And if we don't have that revelation from God, it's not something that we can do by faith. And you notice what happens. The Lord speaks to him. The Lord tells him to leave Ur and to go to where he would show him. But notice what happens in verse 4. It says, "So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him." Again, ask yourself this question: why did Abraham leave? Why did Abraham leave Ur, and why did he go to the land of Canaan? The answer is because it's what God told him to do. Why did he go where he went? Well, it's where the Lord told him to go. Abraham's relationship with God was based upon trust. And God told him, you leave this place, you go to another place. Because Abraham trusted God, that's what Abraham did. And so we have this idea about faith. First of all, God has to tell you to do something, or he has to tell you where to go or to do something in a certain way. And then we have to have enough trust in God that whenever he tells us something, whenever he speaks to us, like he spoke to Abraham, that we do what the Lord told him to do. Now, again, here's what I want to emphasize when it comes to faith. Abraham did not leave Ur of the Chaldees because of some intuition he had. He didn't leave Ur of the Chaldees because of some way that he felt. He didn't leave Ur of the Chaldees because of his personal opinion or preference. He left because God told him to leave. And that's how you do something by faith. God has to reveal something to you, and then you do what the Lord tells you to do. And again, why is that so important, you might ask? Because in the religious world today, a lot of people think about, I trust God, I have faith in God. Well, if you don't do what the Lord told you to do, you don't have faith in the Lord. And if you're just doing something because it's the way that you feel, or because it's your personal preference, that's not doing something by faith. Faith is acting upon revelation from God. And when you get into Hebrews chapter 11, if I had to give a chapter to kind of illustrate this principle, this is one that I would say go to. When you look in verse 2, this is a very interesting statement, but the Hebrew writer says this. He says, by faith, we understand that the world was framed by the word of God. How do we understand that by faith? What does that mean? That means God told us this is the way the world came into existence. And we trust what God says, and so by faith we believe that this world came into existence by God merely speaking the words. You can go through that whole chapter. You can go through how by faith Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. What does that mean? That means he listened to what God said and he did what God said. You can read about in verse 7 how by faith Noah built an ark. Why did Noah build an ark? Why did he build it out of gopher wood? Because God revealed to him that's what he was supposed to do, and he revealed to him that's the material that he was supposed to use. You think about Moses' parents in verse 23. It says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him. You ever wonder why Moses' parents decided to hide Moses whenever he was born? It's because God told them to. It's because God revealed to them what they were supposed to do with him. And so you have this whole principle. You can't have biblical faith without acting or having revelation from God. God speaking something, telling us what to do, telling us where to go, or telling us how to do something. The second fundamental of faith, and we've already hit upon this, but faith takes conviction on our part. It's not just enough for God to say something. We have to have the conviction, we have to have the trust that God is going to be able to do what he says. Notice what God told Abraham in verse 2. He says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Faith on our part, first of all, takes recognition. We have to recognize when God tells us to do something. Abraham did that. He recognized God told him to leave Ur of the Chaldees and to go to a land that he would show him. He also recognized this. God said, if you do this, there are some promises that I'm going to make to you, and I'll keep my promise. As you go through Genesis chapter 12 there, and we just read three great promises that God makes to Abraham. We call them the nation promise, the land promise, and a seed promise. God would make a great nation out of Abraham. God would give him and his descendants a certain area of the land. And then through him, through his seed, one of his descendants would bless all families of the earth. That's the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. So Some preacher has once said, if you notice, if you go through those two verses, look at the I wills of that passage. God says over and over, I will do this, or I will do that. And those promises that God made to Abraham. Those are promises with of a worldwide scope. I mean, there are promises with eternal consequences that are attached to them. They are promises of monumental importance. They weren't small things like, I'll give you a penny if you do this. They were tremendous promises. Did Abraham have the conviction that God would keep his promise? Yeah. Did Abraham have the conviction that God could keep these worldwide promises, this eternal consequence promise that he has made to him? The answer is yes. In fact, we read in the New Testament in Romans chapter 4 and verse 21, it says about Abraham there, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, that is God, he was also able to perform. So here's the question for us when it comes to being convicted when God speaks something. Do we have the faith to believe, number one, that God can do what he says he's going to do, and number two, that he will do what he says he's going to do? And that's true whether he says, that's true whether what he speaks is what we would consider, good or bad for us. Can God do it? Will God do it? Abraham was fully convinced. In fact, you think about Abraham at this point. God tells him, he says, I will make of you a great nation. This is a man who's not even the father of one child yet. And he's very old. Well, he's old enough at this point. He's getting close to past childbearing age. But yet he fully believed when God told him that. Faith emboldened Abraham, that trust that he had in God, that conviction that he had that God can and God will do whatever he has told me, allowed him to embark on the great journey that we start reading about here in chapter 12. And notice verse 4 with me. It says, so Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. You may get tired of hearing me say this, but I can't emphasize it enough. Abraham moved because God told him to move. And today, you think about moving today. Listen, we live in a highly mobile society, right? We move for all kinds of reasons. We might move because we prefer one climate or another. We might move because we get a job or we get a promotion. Sometimes we move just to try to get away from problems. That's not why Abraham moved. Let me ask you this. When's the last time you moved because of your faith? That's why Abraham moved. He moved because God told him to move. And so this is the fundamental of faith, though. God speaks, God reveals. We have enough trust and conviction in God that we do whatever he tells us to do. Okay, the second thing that I want for us to think about, and again, I only have two main points today. Let's talk about the testing of Abraham's faith. Abraham's faith wasn't just accepted without being put to the test. And one person has rightly said, a faith that is not tested or has not been tested cannot be trusted. I want you to think about that for a moment. Why do you believe something, or why do you trust someone or something in this life? It's generally because they have proved to be dependable or reliable, right? We don't usually trust somebody blindly. We don't usually trust some product or some object blindly. It's because this object or this person has proven to be reliable, proven to be trustworthy. And so the question becomes this: did God told Abraham to do this? Did Abraham really trust God? Did he really believe what God had promised him? And there's this biblical idea
throughout both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it is simply this: God allows the genuineness of our faith to be tested. Some person says, well, I believe God or I trust God. Well, how do I know? And how do you know that? And so God allows testing of our faith throughout our life here upon this earth. In fact, Peter describes it in 1 Peter 1 and verse 7. He talks about the genuineness of your faith. Is your faith in God genuine or is it not? How do you know? Well, you got to put your faith to the test, don't you? That's where the proof is. And so he goes on to talk about it, though, in this way, and this is a common way that the testing of our faith is spoken of in the Scripture. He said, being much more precious than gold that perishes, that is tested by fire. The testing of gold, that's a pretty easy illustration to understand. Why do you take gold? You know, people dig up from the earth, they say, well, this is gold. How do you know it's gold? We got to test it, right? Well, how do you test it and make sure it's gold or not? You pass it through the fire. If it passes the test of the fire, see, the fire burns up everything else that isn't gold. It burns out all the impurities. And then on the other side, the only thing that you have left is gold. That's the test. And our faith is like that too. How do I know I have faith in God? You go through the trials. You go through the fiery trials that Peter talks about there. Whatever is in faith is going to get burned up, right? And whatever passes out on the other side is true faith. And so Peter likens it to the idea of testing gold. That's not just a New Testament idea. Job said this in the Old Testament in Job 23 and verse 10, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. God's purpose in allowing the testing of our faith is to prove that our faith is genuine. It's to remove all the impurities that are inside and outside of our faith. And the only way that you ever advance in what we're going to describe as the school of faith, you got to take the examination, you got to take the test, right? Just like any course that you go through here in life. You go to school, you take a certain course. How do you advance? You got to pass the test, right? You got to take the exams. If you pass the exams, if you pass the test, you succeed, you get victory. Faith is the same way. And so our faith has to be tested. Abraham's faith came, or the test of his faith came in at least three forms. I'm only going to talk about two of them this morning. I'll try to save the next one for the next chapter in some way. But here's two ways that you'll read about Abraham's faith being tested. First of all, his faith in God was tested by the circumstances around him. Notice what happens in verse 10 here of Genesis 12. It says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. God tells Abraham, he says, I want you to leave Ur. I want you to go to the land of Canaan. Abraham leaves and he goes there, and what happens? Well, there's a great famine that hits that land. I don't know, what do you think Abraham and Sarah and his family thought would happen whenever they got to this place that God promised them? I, as a regular human being, just in my mind, I would think, well, once we get there, everything's going to be okay, right? God's going to take care of us. But the first test is a very severe famine, as the Bible describes it there. There's no record as you read about the life of Abraham. I don't know, it may have happened, but there is no record that Abraham ever faced a famine in Ur. Now he's confronted with a very great problem. He has to find food. And you might think, well, what's the big deal, right? Doesn't have any children. All he has to worry about is himself and his wife, Sarah. Abraham had a large family, and he had a large house. In fact, when we get over into chapter 14 there, in verse 14, we read about Lot, his nephew, being taken captive. And notice what Abraham does. It says there, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house. This guy had 318 servants who were trained to fight. That's not all the servants he had. He had flocks. He had herds. He had a tremendous amount of animals. He had a tremendous amount of people that he had to see that they got food. And so would he trust God, or would he give up, and would he go back home and say, I know back there, there's plenty of food for us to have? Some people think when it comes to being a Christian, and I think this is really true with a lot of new Christians, they think if I do what God tells me to do, everything should be perfect, right? Wrong. In fact, the Bible tells us the moment you start doing the things that God tells you to do, it brings up a whole new set of circumstances and a whole new set of problems. Now, the difference is when you become a Christian, not that you're not going to have any problems in life. The difference is now you have God on your side. And now you have God, the promise of God to be with you through these difficult and trying times in this life. And that's what got Abraham through the trials of his life. He knew that God was with him. Here's something else we need to know. We need to know that these things are for our own good. And that's not, that's like when you're a kid and your mom and dad say, now I'm going to give you a spanking, but it's for your own good. You think, well, how's that good for me, right? This going to hurt. That's not a good thing. But in the end, looking back over your life and your childhood, you can say that was a good thing, right? The trying of our faith is a lot like that too. I think when trials arise in our life, we look at it and we say, the Bible says, this is a good thing for you. And we say, how can this be good? It hurts. It's difficult. But when we get on the other side, and even sometimes in this life, when you get through that difficult trial and you look back on it, you can say, that was good for me. I grew. And that's what the Bible tells us about our faith. In James chapter 1 and verses 2 through 4, James wrote there, he said, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. The Bible teaches us this. God uses tough circumstances to build our faith, to make it grow. And this is the great lesson for us. And here's what I want you to notice as we're looking at Abraham's life this morning. I think a lot of times when trials come our way, our initial reaction is we try to get away from them. We try to run away from them. And in fact, we probably do everything within our power to try to stop whatever difficult circumstances are arising in our life. And that's exactly what Abraham does in a lot of these situations too. He tries to escape the problem. Here's the lesson for us, I think. Whenever our faith is put to the test, the question shouldn't be, how can I get out of this? How can I make it stop? The question for us as Christians is, what can I get out of this? And that's what James talks about there. We know that the trying of our faith produces patience. We know that God's goal in allowing these trials to come into our life is to perfect us, to complete us, to make us into the type of people that He wants us to be. And so the Bible tells us this: God allows these trials of our faith, number one, to prove if they're genuine, but number two, to try to get our faith to grow, to try to strengthen our faith, to try to purify our faith. It's for our own good. And so Abraham here is tested by this circumstance. The second area that Abraham's faith is tested was by people. And the first real significant group of people, I think, that would test the faith of Abraham that's mentioned here is found in verse 6. It says, and Abraham passed through the land of the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And notice this phrase, and the Canaanites were then in the land. When you think about the Canaanites, what do you think about? They were a group of people who were a thorn in God's chosen people for a long time to come after this. Ask yourself this question. Were these Canaanites, were they really godly people? Were they people who had high morals? Were they people of impeccable character? Were their religious practices in accordance with Abraham's religious practices? I think the difference was night and day. It couldn't have been easy for Abraham to live in an immoral, in a ungodly place full of characters and wickedness and sinfulness, but yet it was a test of his faith, wasn't it? Does Abraham really trust me? Will he remain faithful? Friends, that's us as Christians in the world today. That's the test. Surrounded by wickedness, surrounded by ungodliness. It's not that we don't have a core like the church today. We do. But a lot of times we're out there on an island all by ourselves, surrounded by all these ungodly people. Will we be faithful to the Lord? Abraham passed that test. His faith to God remained true, even though some of the people surrounding him were not the best of people. Notice the next test in verse 11 there of Genesis 12. It came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, remember he had to leave the land of Canaan because there wasn't any food there, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." Abraham left Canaan in order to escape problems, right? Did he do that by going to Egypt? No, he just ran into a new set of problems. And that's often, I think, what happens when we try to run away from problems. Notice, though, as you read about this, Abraham faced a problem, and his problem was this: he was afraid. He had a very beautiful wife. He says, "Listen, the Egyptians, they're not godly people, right? And so there's a good chance if we go down here and I tell them that you're my wife, they'll kill me, and then they'll take you for their wife. And so let's tell them that you're my sister. Will you do that for me? Will you help, save my life?" Well, I guess Sarah was a pretty good woman, because I don't know that many of the women today could go along with something like that. But that's what Abraham asked her to do. And so Abraham and Sarah agreed upon, I'm not going to be too harsh on Abraham here, but I am going to point out a couple of things. They agreed upon a half-truth. Okay. What they said technically was true. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment. But was that everything that needed to be said in that situation? No. They deceitfully withheld information that would have been profitable to what goes on and happen. And so here you have this idea. What's Abraham do? Well, he runs away from the famine. Now he's trying to escape this problem, right? And so he does it by telling a half-truth. And how does that end up? Well, the same way when we usually try to do things to escape trouble. It ends up just as bad or worse than what you imagined. And we're not going to read all this, but if you know the story, well, he comes into the land. Everybody says, well, this is Abraham's sister. And the Egyptian says, listen, this is a beautiful woman. We need to tell Pharaoh about her. Practice of the kings and the rulers of that day and age. You married as many women as you could and as beautiful as you could find. We need to tell Pharaoh about this woman. So Pharaoh inquires and brings her over into his house and basically begins the process of what we would describe as eloping, or her becoming his wife. Well, thankfully, God intervened before it got out of hand. And so God reveals to Pharaoh that, hey, this is another man's wife. If you don't send her back, you're going to be a dead man. And so Pharaoh ends up returning her. But notice what he says in verses 18 and 19. Notice the questions that he asked Abraham. Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister?" You know what the truthful answer is to all those? He was afraid, wasn't he? And we have this principle that faith and fear cannot dwell in the same heart that is devoted to God. Fear will always conquer faith, and faith will always conquer fear. And so Abraham said this because he did not fully trust God, right? He didn't say, we just tell the truth and, God is with us and he's going to take care of us and whatever the situation happens, it'll turn out okay. Abraham took his eyes off of God, and guess who he started thinking about first? Himself. And friends, that's what we often do when our faith fails too. We take our eyes off God and we start thinking about ourselves first. Now again, in fairness, this was technically true. Sarah was his half-sister. But Abraham, the point in doing this was Abraham was trying to save his own skin. And here's where I really want this lesson to come home to us this morning. Abraham was a man of faith, but he was a human. Okay, if you read about his life, did he do everything perfectly all the time? No. Did he have great faith in God? He did. Did he have tests in this life that his faith went through? Yes, he did. Sometimes he passed those tests. Most of the time, he passed those tests. Sometimes he didn't, though. Sometimes his faith fell short of what God wanted it to be. And you ask yourself this question, was Abraham thinking of himself here? I thought about Ephesians chapter 5, where it talks about the husband and wife relationship, where Paul said, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it." That was exactly the opposite of what Abraham was trying to do, wasn't it? He said, "I don't want to die. Sacrifice yourself for me." Because think about what it did to Sarah. I mean, not just Abraham, but think about the predicament that it put her in. There was no real benefits that came from disobedience and distrust. And that's the same is true with us today. Listen, when you study about Abraham, as we go through this study, you're going to find his faith is tested time and time again. His love life is tested. His family life is tested. His business life is tested. His physical life. All these things are subjected to pressures. But what he learns, remember, God is trying to teach him lessons through this. What he learns through all these things is sometimes his faith was a little bit shaky, but God was always steadfast. And I think that's the lesson that we get when our faith is tested too. A preacher once asked a church member, out of curiosity, he said, "What is your favorite book of the Bible?" And the man didn't miss a beat. He said, "The book of Genesis." And the preacher thought, what in the world? Of all the books in the Bible, he said, well, why would you choose the book of Genesis? He says, because when I read about people like Abraham and Jacob and the things that they did, they're just as bad or worse. It's what I've done. Well, that's not the reason that God put these things in the Bible, so that we can point fingers and say, they did worse than I did and feel good about it. But I think it is this principle. Abraham was not a perfect man, but he was a man of faith. And his faith went through many, many tests in this life. Some of those tests he failed. Most of them he passed. Through it all, his faith grew. And it became stronger and stronger until he became the Bible example for what it means to have faith in God. I think that's why he's in the Bible for us today. A great example for us to follow, a great example for us to learn from. Maybe there's one in the audience here this morning who's not yet a child of God, though. We want to give you an opportunity to do that. Somebody says, how? Fundamentals of the faith. God speaks. God says, here's what you need to do to have your sins forgiven. Here's what you need to do to become one of my children. Our part is conviction. Our part is we believe what God says. When I do this, my sins are washed away. When I do this, I become a child of God. And because we trust God, we do what the Lord tells us to do. And after we do that, listen, our faith is going to be tested over and over again. It's going to be like the gold that passes through the fire. It's going to be tested with the circumstances that surround us. It's going to be tested by the people who live by our sides. But if we grow through that testing process and we learn to trust God no matter what, just like Abraham did, in the end, we're going to get the promises and the blessings that God has given to each one of us. Maybe you're here in our